So the first activity we thought we could have like a larger breakout group. So just divide ourselves in two different groups. One should be talking about like what are some of the time and spatial scales that we need to be aware of, and how do we bridge this scales, and what do we need. And the other group should be talking about what are some of the definitions and units that we need to agree on as a community. So the idea is that one group meets here, the other one can take a room somewhere else. And you guys are welcome to switch between the groups. So if you get bored of one conversation, the other one is more interesting. I'll try not to be offended. So we're gonna do that for about like 40 minutes. And then we will have some coffee break. And then we're gonna have the short talks. We're gonna have to stay on time. So if you're giving a short talk, I aim for 4.5 minutes. So we have some transition time and nobody's like kept here way past our lunchtime. So the last thing is Waller was supposed to be here to help with one of the conversations. Does anyone want to volunteer to moderate definitions? Otherwise, I'm going to close my eyes and find something. Thank you. The online group, do you want to do your own or just join whatever's happening on the main room? Yeah. I hear time and space from two people online. Okay. So let's do time and space here, and we can have the online group join, and then definitions can go in the lobby where the coffee is and the snacks. And we'll do this for about 40 minutes, and then have the coffee break. And then 10 o'clock, the shrimp dogs here.
Do they? Yeah.
Like, what's his biomass?
Biomass, another above.
He just had that. This one is gonna be time and scale.
Thank you.
And they are going to. Definitions.
No, both.
Yeah.
Well,
Or chat there, but if you want to check on people down there, just keep an eye on people raise hands. Sarah and stuff, you're open to unmute when you want to join in, or we'll try to catch. Maybe we can, so sorry. Let us know if you can hear me.
I should probably, maybe have an online document for that so they can work on it as well. Yeah. Sure.
You want to share one document for the room and for online?
Yeah.
Okay.
Take her. Please, can we take them some, this room, or if we bring some of this, while we did show. Yeah, I figured you'd be here in a minute. Okay. So what are people's thoughts? What are some of the, what motivated me to put this as a topic is that a lot of what we have is like individual time series at a very specific location. That's not, doesn't necessarily scale up if you're gonna be working with like a regional model, a global model, you know, trying to do a budget for a whole region. We had the C cards OCB funded activity for the North American carbon budgets, coastal carbon budgets. And a lot of it's like, well, the benthic fluxes, we have a better handle on it, but there's a lot of spatial temporal variability in the data that might just be there. So, how do we make sure that that is the case? And if so, how much can we smooth that out? And what are some of the tools that we need for that? Great.
For time and space, it's very, we need to first kind of have a division on coastal versus open ocean. I feel like the time and space is way more important in the coastal environment, shallow, especially shallow areas where it's impacted by wind and wave action, compared to open water, where the interaction between the bottom and the overlying water column is smaller. So I think maybe we need to divide that out first, whether we are looking at coastal or deeper ocean in terms of time and space, and then have a kind of a detail for each of those.
That's a question I had too. So like from a modeler perspective, it's very easy to have, different models set up for different regions, and then you're at the convenience of applying different methods to different regions. And that makes sense because they're governed by different processes. But also there's a dream of mine that, we have a continuous model from, river, estuary, coastal bays to open oceans. Right? I think that would be nice if you have a continuous model, because model by itself, it's self-agreeing, right? And when you have different setups, you create this boundaries that doesn't agree with each other. Yeah. So I guess if we want to divide, where we divide.
Yeah.
Something.
Well, I mean, somebody wants to continue on this discussion with you.
Yeah, something I'm wondering is here is like yesterday we were talking about the calcite compensation depth. And that's an actual chemical boundary that it exists and moves over time, and it can be traced back as a function of some parameters in the ocean. And my question is, maybe we can have boundaries and we can have continuous models, but we only need to be really clear of when these boundaries are actually something that's important and physical. And yeah, I think we can have both actually.
I actually think that you could reoccupy, like, so lots of in the ocean monitoring for time series, one of the things that one approach, like in the water column, right, is to kind of reoccupy spaces with certain time intervals, and the time interval of reoccupation varies with the variability of the region, right? And so, but that same plan exists in order to sort of monitor change. And I guess I wonder if the benthic flux community has considered kind of creating transects that they reoccupy with certain intervals of time in order to kind of like mirror that concept, right? And address this issue.
What would be a good way, like, where and how long to do that if we wanna, like, if, say we're trying to understand like land to ocean processes, right? Like, so this needs to be like a continuum of decreasing resolution. Like, sure.
I have a comment, but I wonder if you had a comment.
I mean, yeah, so I mean, just to continue on, I mean, I think what I was gonna make a point about was the seasonal cycle, and so many of the large continental shelves are at the high latitudes. And what typically happens, I find that most studies go there when they expect a lot of fluxes to happen, right? So, because that's just what the most exciting work is. But when it comes to modeling, we really want to know what the annual average is, right? So if we constrain our models based only on the time periods when all these fluxes are coming out, right? We also need to know when the fluxes are not coming out, right? And so I think, especially at the high latitudes, also knowing what the fluxes are, in the winter when not much is happening versus the summer, and like there could be some buildup of like some of these nutrients, or also in the winter that then is released in the summer when all these, POC reaches there and all this kind of redox chain can really be the most intense. And so
Sure.
So I am biased towards the coastal zone, but I wondered if, you know, how in the open ocean you have a long coast provinces, whether we could create something like that for the coastal zone, but, focus our initial studies on areas that, well, the small scale question that, you thought of. Like, focus our attention on those areas that will have a outsized change disproportionate or impact disproportionate to their area, on fluxes.
Yeah, I'll just bring a counter argument to that, and that is just for the sake of discussion here. There was one thing that's like when one comment on one of the breakout groups yesterday, that if we want to prioritize places to study, then maybe we should pick a more boring place. Because to have like some baseline and some basic
That's right.
understanding before we, so
That's right.
and that's along the lines of what the both of you are saying, right? We tend to go for the exciting stuff, right? It's one of the cons, like, well, modelers need averages and observationalists need a cool story, right? So.
I don't know, I need a cool story.
Sometimes.
Christoph?
Not weather.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, you can. Just to follow up on the previous remark of, these, what I would say, high energy or high intensity events that we quote, like for the high latitudes, like when the ice break down, for example, and a lot of fluxes are deposited. I think these fluxes are generally major in the system in terms of deposition, at least. Like I'm thinking also of flood deposition, for example, from river outlets. And so this is a period of time where very intense processes occur. And if you want to understand the fluxes, the exchange fluxes, both the deposition, but also the recycling and the relaxation of the system, you should really focus on these ones. And of course, you don't want to miss the period where nothing happens. Let's say a buildup of things in the sediment, but little exchange with the water arise. But you don't want to miss this very high intensity events. So that's something that and that, to our experience, requires a very specialized device to investigate. So let's observe. Let's say observe, and also to model. So I think that's something that we should also keep in mind, at least for some of the systems that we're looking at. But my perception of the system is that it's getting more and more in all the environments that we study, not only in the coastal zone, but also let's say at the outlets of canyons in the abyssal plains. These high intensity processes are important. So we should keep that in mind and try to think about how to observe them and how to model them. Well, we have some tools already, but I think more are needed.
Yeah, that's the spatial part of it and the importance of extreme events, right, which are going to have an outsized impact. But then we're back to how do we monitor extreme events?
So if we go with like reoccupying the sampling sites Samantha just told us, that will partially accomplish that, right? Because we are sampling the same spot every time. And then we are able to kind of, depending on how long is the section, for instance, we can monitor coastal and deep ocean. We can see the issues regarding the seasonal cycles. We can think about extreme events simply because we have a well-sampled place. And it could be a boring one.
So one of the things that I've been encouraging within the US waters for NOAA's monitoring program is to augment the water column sampling with cores, right? And I don't do this, right? Like, so I'm encouraging it because we need this data at irregular intervals of time. And so, and they do it every 3 to 5 years, all of the large marine ecosystems, you know what I mean? So that they rotate around from the East Coast to, Gulf of Mexico to the West Coast of the US and around Alaska. And so, you know, kind of that, with that interval, then you would have full water column biogeochemistry, phytoplankton toes, and then the cores kind of to correspond with it in order to try and get that, the shelf area anyway, kind of monitored. So that's something that we're working on. But like kind of as an example, so that if there are lines like that exist in other places, it could be, you know, something to sort of like augment with this kind of activity. Yeah.
Add to that, I would say we should also, whenever we do observation, we should have physics like ADB or because,
Yeah.
I mean, I've been struggling with this huge data set of SOC versus bottom oxygen in Gulf of Mexico. And depending on which data you pick, it could either be a positive or a negative relationship between SOC and oxygen, bottom water. The reason is there is no physics. The ADB data is missing. So I think if we do chemistry, we need to have some basic physics data to argument that, to make sense of fluxes.
I'm just gonna second that from, like, I'm not doing like sediment fluxes, I'm doing like coral reef carbon chemistry, but we have the same issue where the, like NOAA's National Coral Reef Monitoring Program does like seawater chemistry really well, and like benthic habitat surveys, like transects pretty well, but there's never any hydrodynamic data to go to it, so I've been just searching for models
Yeah, and
to
similar.
complement the data.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
Well, and similarly, the OI has, right, like kind of places that are well equipped, right? And so those, I don't know if people have tried to sort of add this kind of monitoring to that. So like as places where this kind of site, you know, siting could happen, but, yeah.
In general, I think focusing on co-locating
Yeah.
different kinds of data. Which sounds really simple, but it's
No,
not.
it's not. Yeah. Christoph?
Yes, coming back to this physics kind of stuff, there are also now like more or less operational physics, how you said, the circulation models. Maybe not at the right scale for the right purpose for the purpose that we need, but we can have an idea of not really the real conditions near the interface, if that's what Kei-chan was mentioning, but we can have an idea of the main circulation patterns. And also one thing that we should think of that I was referring to in my previous intervention was that more that you know, having monitoring stations out there, so that we could have, as the previous person said, we can have transects of coring, like you can have repeated transects, but I think having some monitoring devices, like we could call it a benthic station, whatever, that would have some physics part, like and some biogeochemistry part also looking into the sediment could be also very beneficial, because a lot of things probably happen on a short time scale, a scale that you cannot capture with cruises. Some other appear on cruises time, but so we should couple, I think, the two approaches, also monitoring the seafloor and potentially the biogeochemistry inside the sediments.
Yeah, hi. So I agree with everything Christoph just said, actually, but I mean, one approach, because the water column programs like Argo and Ghost Ship and ocean sites have some seriously good coverage of the ocean, not at high frequency always, but over big areas. And Argo does give circulation based on where the drifters go. So trying to establish some periodic sampling stations that track those usually well-sustained and funded programs would give us the overlying, and including biogeochemical Argo, would give us some of the biogeochemistry in the water column, more information about potential fluxes and circulation and so on. Trying to find who would fund benthic studies underneath those is is more difficult, but I think it's time to start making that case.
Yeah, I hope we can put out a compelling argument to justify that. Shirley?
I think if we're also doing any studies in the coastal zone and looking at the spatial and temporal variability, we're thinking about benthic collapse coupling, we do also need to couple the land processes to downstream impacts along that land ocean. I know it's sink to source and source to sink, and we were rehashing the same idea, but you can't, I mean, I guess you could think of it as a black box and just say, okay, well, this just happens to be my input, but your input, your composition of your organic carbon, the iron that's associated with it, that all of that could have just happened upstream in the river system before it actually makes it to your marine environment. So I think we do need to start again, or people already have thinking, you know, making that connection between vegetation type, land use, lithology.
I want to second that, but what I find out is on terrestrial system, you have pretty good monitoring from USGS, river gauges, discharges, and in the ocean, you have Argo data, all the buoys, but really it's like on the shelf and the coast is like, no, I don't know who is dealing with that, but it's like a blank. And then that area happened to be most difficult to resolve, and also a lot of processes. You have light and you have intense mixing, sediment is getting dredged up. All these processes is not resolved. So could be true that a lot of signals we see is coming from this interface of land and ocean.
Yeah, I think the source question is really important, and being able to establish and like confirm connectivity. So identifying what the source actually is, because in some cases, I think we kind of assume, I mean, I think again, I'm out of depth in the like riverine inputs and things like those. It's pretty straightforward, like, yeah, probably coming out of this river or something. But for some of like the coastal dynamics that I'm looking at, it's not always clear what the source water is for the sites that I'm looking at. So bringing in hydrodynamics there as well, and the kind of physical influence to actually identify what is the relevant source water and processes impacting that. And if there isn't data in that area, that is important as a source or end member, like funding that or figuring out how to fill in those data gaps.
Yeah, I've been thinking of one way to bridge this gap is to have really good understanding on the transport of mass and energy between boundaries. So like how much water is going on and off the shelf, how much heat. Is there data doing that, or is there an easy way to monitor that? Satellite image, I don't know, or transects acoustic, I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking of what Lisa said about the Argo floats, and well, the Argo floats they're going out in the open ocean, so they're going out very far. Most of the time, you don't get them back because they're getting old and they're getting lost in the ocean, but they give a lot of very interesting results. The thing about the coastal ocean, for example, it's connected to the land. So in most instances, you can launch things and have things returned to you or close to you that you can go and get back. So there has been a set of glider transects, coastal gliders, that's being developed. So we use them in the Gulf of Lion, in the Mediterranean. That's been used also in Oregon. They've launched a series of gliders to probably in some other places that I don't know. But because this connection to the land that we have in the coastal ocean, I think we should make use of these platforms that are pretty similar in the carrying weight to the Argo floats. CTD, oxygen, turbidity, that the kind of things, chlorophyll that we would like to have in the coastal ocean, and then that would sort of cover these main variables in the coastal ocean, make transects that we were referring to before, from the land to the open ocean, and work on this connectivity between the continent, coast, and ocean. Of course, I will not give you benthic data, not much, but it could cover, and I think with reasonable cost, the biogeochemistry of the coastal zone up to the slope or near the continents, I would say. So that's one thing that we should consider at some point for studying the part of the ocean that is closest to the land.
I think another point that came up yesterday is how close can you get physical data on a regular basis to the floor, to the seafloor, right? Because if you have agroflows, they go pretty deep, but they don't go deep. So we're still missing that little chunk there of, benthic to agroflows, and what can we do about that, I guess? The question, or how much is that really, can we just interpolate based on physical understanding of processes?
Tripods are not that expensive.
Mhm.
Especially for shallow water. I mean, we have put in tripods with ADBs and oxygen sensors, pH sensors. They do not cost that much.
Would that be
$25,000, you can put in a small tripod. And so that's definitely a way to kind of bridge that gap between the bottom 2 meter, where typically we do not have any data. We will need to put a CDD that close, right? So I think inexpensive tripods, simple things like ADB, tripod, oxygen, pH.
So
could
maybe
give us-
add a suite of more than just the core with the oceanographic measurement.
I would love to see those.
Yeah, the problem is we do use them every time there is a hurricane, but we get buried in meters of mud, but they really give data when we get it back. Really good data at the bottom 2 meters.
So you can recover it.
Oh, yeah,
After
so
you
it has a
unbury it.
pop-up buoy, so we know we can just acoustically release that buoy and it pops up and we just put it back up.
No, I meant after the hurricane, can dig it out or no?
No. Insurance no longer covers.
Yeah.
Put any tripods in water, put the insurance on me.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's doable. I mean, you lose some, but usually get back most of it.
That's good.
What else?
Are you thinking pie in the sky?
Yeah,
Unlimited resources?
Yeah.
I think you need to start, not start, but just, if we're talking about, normalization of all the types of data that we collect, we should start just collecting, isotope ratios. Delta 18 in water, but also any of the, core water samples that we take to deconvolve a lot of the complicated relationships that we talked about as the iron, nitrogen, carbon, and other macro and micronutrients.
good stuff.
Cristina, that was in your notes at some point, the notes that you sent this morning. Collect that's just to say, to follow on the previous remark, collect the data that are existing. So if we could have so there are already collections going on, like Pangea has a pretty big power collection, but if we could like complement that with all the data that we have in our drawers, all of us, that would be really substantial, I guess. So I think we should definitely try and do something about it. Yeah. So one other point that I would like to raise is because we raised that in the group breakout group we had yesterday, was this sort of I would call it the upscaling issue that we all have, because when we go to a region, we take like 3 cores, or let's say some hundreds of square centimeter, and then we extrapolate that to like several square kilometers or more, sometimes over a region. So how to do that, I would say, properly, to do that in a clean way, to do that in a more intelligent or way, that's really a problem that I think we all face. And we all do simple math, multiplication of the fluxes we have to the number of square meter that in the region that we are considering. But so that's one thing that we should definitely think of better.
I think regarding this issue, our assumption is that our point in space is representative of the entire area, right? And I'm wondering if there's like indirect ways to assess for the region before choosing a sampling point. Maybe we can find a region that's representative of the entire area instead of just randomly picking one point. Like, so we should improve our assumptions based on maybe on statistical information and whatever we can get our hands on.
But there are those measurements that basically measuring the average of an area, right? There are like, I don't know, Matt was showing yesterday, there are these like traps of bubbles and chambers that whatever you measure is the average of this slot you already put out. It's not going to be so different from 1 point to 1 square meters, but that is it's the difference from point measurements to a area measurement.
Yeah, there are definitely methods that do that, but not all of them are like that.
And that's good for permeable, more permeable sediment and sand, so that's, you can't do that in muddy sediment.
Yeah.
So what are some variables that are out there that we should focus on synthesizing? Data's out there. There's a lot that we're not using because it's all over the place. But you can't do all of them at once. What's one that would be important for the continuum and that we think we're not making good use of?
Bottom stress
Bottom stress.
that can go along the continuum.
Mhm. Yeah, bottom stress has been coming up a lot, like in the breakout groups. So.
Bottom stress is not something we often really consider a lot. Usually, like in many studies, they usually don't mention a lot about the bottom stress and relation. So I think it's something that we really pay more attention going forward. Yeah.
I think bottom stress is a consequence of the bottom roughness and the interaction with the currents and waves that's in there. So probably grain size would be useful.
Mhm.
Obviously having hydrodynamics would be useful. I really like Sarah's approach on the structure of the community that somehow well, she presented us yesterday with Sarah, right?
Mhm.
She presented us like information of how different communities are structured in different areas, meaning that there is coherence among the environments they are living at. And that could also be a really cool indicator of what we should look at in these areas. Although I don't don't know if the data is easily to get to.
So come up with some metrics to define the community structure in different sites.
And relate that to some of like, if I understand from what you're saying. So with the structuring in the community, we could find a way to kind of relate that to some of the physical.
Yes,
parameters. And
exactly.
then from there on, we can
Because-
see, we can extrapolate to other.
Yeah.
I think one indirect measurement could be sedimentation rate, because usually bentos die out. I'm not a biologist, but I think usually higher sedimentation rate usually smaller than bentos, so it could be a proxy. Yeah, sedimentation rate could be a proxy. You find some.
Is it hard to get segmentation rate?
There's quite a bit. Yeah, it's kind of.
Lisa? You're muted. Lisa.
I don't know how many people are familiar with the Goose Essential Ocean Variables, but there's a biogeochemistry panel and a physics panel and a biology ecology panel. And the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy has been looking, it's very specifically at variables that are relevant on the benthos. And so they've identified seafloor labile organic matter, seafloor respiration, seafloor fluid and gas fluxes, and also litter. And they're working with the more shallow biogeochemistry panel, which already has oxygen, nutrients, inorganic carbon, transient tracers, particulate matter, nitrous oxide, stable carbon isotopes, and dissolved organic carbon and ocean color. So all I'm gonna suggest is that, like, if a set of variables are identified by this group, that they then go to the biogeochem panels for Goose and Deuce. Felix Jansen leads the Deuce one, and I don't know who leads the Goose one, but this is a way to try to get the specs uniform and also adopted by a large number of people, and have them turn into standard best practices for benthic work, for example.
And also remember that Deuce is having their virtual annual meeting in May, so keep an eye open for that. Easy to participate. Goose? Deuce, Deep Ocean Observatory.
Yes.
Yeah. So to solve problems. So from the ones we identified, like, that there is a lot of data out there, which ones are the easiest to turn it into a monitoring system? If we pie in the sky, if we're thinking of everything, we can get isotopes, we can get the tripods, we can get the sediment cores along with oceanographic, like with water column measurement.
And we're thinking about cross space, so
Mhm.
from the coast to the open ocean.
So to monitor, would isotopes be the best way to infer land influence on, like,
That'll tell you your source of waters.
your source water?
You can deconvolve it if they have separate signatures,
Right.
which is like useful for places like I mean, I've seen it done for the Gulf of Mexico and Mississippi. So a
You're
bunch of
talking about
different-
oxygen isotopes?
Those like Alan Green's.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
It is complicated. It's like deconvolving,
Yeah,
it's like an oil.
because especially now the evaporation plays a huge role in trying to deconvolute
But
that
the
data.
signatures are really different for the Pearl and the Mississippi River, and the other one, I forget. That's a little further.
Mhm. You mean modern?
Yeah. they were able to deconvolve all three of those water sources for the Mississippi Bight.
Marine chemistry paper is saying.
Would isotope measurements in the bottom sediment give you fluxes?
They tell you what happened.
No, but they'll tell you the process. They'll tell you something about organic carbon respiration of, say, marine versus terrestrial degree
Yeah, I think a classic example is
respiration.
Gulf of Mexico shelf, where we expect a lot of terrestrial organic matter in the sediment, but they are not. It's a marine signature, which is so intriguing.
Yeah.
You think the Mississippi River brings so much terrestrial organic matter, it should be in the sediment, but it's, most of the isotope data shows it's more marine, which is very surprising.
So like if you're looking at that benthic pelagic coupling, here's all this phytoplankton in primary production, how much of it is being stored, what's your flux in the sediment, and how much of it is being fluxed out of the sediment in form of DIC. Like it's gonna help you close that loop.
Connect the pelagic.
Process wise.
And identify which dominant redox pathway.
That's right.
Do you think you'll be able to pick up like extreme events as well?
I wonder how
I don't know.
routinely we can get such
Do
measures.
they bring different sources?
I don't know,
Okay.
Because
but we do have some of that data after a cyclone.
Oh.
Yeah, we just haven't thought about it.
Yeah.
And the content has a lot of data about extreme events.
Stanley?
yeah, I was wondering like, with the isotope data, how routine we could get, how frequent those kind of data might be available, because I imagine, I'm not sure how the analysis goes. Is it something that you can?
It's very, very, very inexpensive.
Inexpensive, but
Yeah.
then
$15 you can get
scale it
isotope data.
to minute, okay?
Yeah.
Understood.
Very, very inexpensive.
I mean, $15 a sample, in my mind, is inexpensive,
Yeah,
including labor cost.
yeah.
Oh,
And that'll give you delta CCP, delta FT, yeah.
Yeah, I think that then it makes the overall sense, make it more like. a-
Stabilized dose is 400.
Yeah, very, yeah.
Okay, we should wrap up. Any final comments?
Also, I
would-
just want to mention about, like, so I think you mentioned, earlier on, we were talking about, boundaries and all of that. So I was thinking about, especially from the model side, how we could start thinking about not only just modeling, not only like the coastal, within the coastal domain, but also thinking about it sort of like boundless system that loop through, go from the continental part up to the coastal domain, how we could, from the community of models to start to integrate such concept into the way we design models, the way we develop models in that direction. Because I know some group over in Brussels thinking in that direction, how to kind of develop models that are able to kind of incorporate processes that both include both terrestrial components that of the marine side.
I would argue that we need a hierarchy of models in the same study for now. I think we get, because the ever increasing resolution as it draw near to the coast, I can't see that as a sustainable way to solve all our problems.
And if all the models draw their boundaries in the same place, there's never gonna be a model that resolve, say, shelf dynamics, right? Everybody break on the shelf. Then,
They
That's
do.
not my experience.
Hmm?
I said, that's not my experience. I guess I think the boundaries that a lot of the coastal models draw tend to be further offshore. And then there are some nested like estuary models, like within those that may have a break on the shelf, but in that part, I'm not sure. Yeah, there is also a global model I was mentioning before that there's one now called Icon Coast that has been developed in Germany, and they go from the coast, they extend from the estuaries all the way out to the open ocean with like telescoping resolution, and those results, including biochemistry, are available for people to investigate. It's still fairly coarse at the coast, but something for folks to look at.
I remember that we watched the seminar a few weeks ago, I think it was maybe Christoph, about the pike environment and how the sediment changed over time. And what I'm thinking here is that sometimes we have assumptions related regarding the stability of the system. So let's say it's in a given state, and then some event comes and it changes to a different state, and then it will converge back to the previous state or just permanently move to a new one. What I'm thinking here is like, shouldn't we understand this process better as you get like to these states we're measuring and studying to, and in order to be able like to extrapolate them over time. I don't know, it's coming to my mind, so I can't really explain it yet. But basically,
I see your point about the state, but
Yeah.
we did a lot of work on trying to understand this sort of stability state.
yeah,
So
yeah.
when you have the system impact curve, and then how long does it come back? You know, the relaxation time.
Yeah, so when when we are sampling something, we are not able to know where we are in this state, but at least we should have tried to look for information that would give us some baseline.
Yeah.
Please.
I would like to add to this discussion. One thing that it's very important for me, especially because I come from a country that doesn't matter a lot about science, is that we think to choose parameters that we could get the data, that the countries that are not so developed could acquire this data, because we think, and it, of course, it's important we have a better instrument to get the data, the technology that maybe most countries can get. How can we access this data if we haven't the access to the financial support? So it think that could be included as the main parameters or simpler parameters that could get some information to start in a point, whatever they were, and then we find places that could be not more important. It's not because I think the whole world is important, but choose according to the data we acquired, some places to start, and then spread this information, especially in this country that have conditions for research. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because it's sometimes easy to talk countries, United States, Europe, that have conditions to support some research. But for us in developing countries, sometimes it's not easy. We have a lot of projects. All of them are important for a certain area, a certain subject, but we can complete all those projects because we haven't financial support. So it's a point that make sometimes needed the help of other countries. And yeah, I think we start to think about how we can help these countries, what I can do for them. It's not a kind of they are, as I said yesterday, oh, they are poor of them. No, it's because we need this information to get a better models. If I have only few places with data, we have no model. We have model for that place, not for the entire world, the entire ocean, or at least we don't know about different places. So we needed to start with a few information, at least, to choose some areas. And when we got the information, oh, that's nice, we have a lot of information for these places, we can go to another places and add information of that place, those places. That's my thing.
Thanks for bringing it up.
on this note, I wanted to say that it's especially for deep sea science, it's important to make the deep sea more accessible, because with all these parameters, sometimes it's just very expensive to go and collect things in the deep sea. Just because you need from ship time to equipment to manpower. So it's really important to make science more accessible.
Yeah, and yesterday some presentations have showed how different are the quantity of data of North Hemisphere from South. So how can I get a good model if I have the representation of all those places?
Similar, we're talking about data gap. One area I feel like there may not be enough data. I mean, we all have our silos, shell, estuaries, deep ocean. But what about continental slope? Is that important? It's a hard place to do basic classes. I think Christoph has a little bit of data, I know, but most people we don't really have much basic data along the slope. I don't know how important it is in a model perspective. I'm glad it should be. And how do we tackle that? It's not an easy place.
Okay, we should break for a few minutes.
So thank you for the opportunity to come and speak for a few minutes, to have my 4.5 minutes of fame, I guess to say. I want to talk about the upper millimeter of sediments, especially in illuminated sediments, and what the oxygen dynamics are. I don't think that a lot of people have a good appreciation for the extreme conditions that happen within this environment. There are huge biogeochemical gradients going from anoxic to 1,000, 10 times the O2 saturation, which means you form free radicals and peroxides, all within the period of minutes to hours. This is just an example of all the range and variation just over an 8-hour period in the upper millimeter of sediments in an estuarine environment. And I'm sure the same thing happens out on the continental shelf. I use these data a lot to calculate net oxygen fluxes and production, net community production and respiration in mostly estuarine sediments, but I have done it on some shelf sediments. But I want to point out, you know, it's one of the things that bothers me a lot about biogeochemistry and a lot of these rates and processes that people talk about. So the challenge or opportunity slide here, I think we don't really understand the true kinetics that are happening in that upper millimeter of sediment. I think, you know, a lot of the data are based on fluxes and rates that happen at centimeter intervals, and these micron intervals are the ones that concern me. I think we need to have a better characterization of the spatiotemporal dynamics of those kinetics, those chemical kinetics in that layer. I think we need to be thinking about three-dimensional multi-parameter models as opposed to two-dimensional. I mean, almost every graph we've seen has all been in 2 dimensions. And these processes are happening in 3 dimensions, and we need to be able to model those in 3-dimensional aspects. I'm glad there are people who model. I don't model. I'll be glad to give you data, but I won't model. I just want to point out that, you know, there are very extreme conditions. pH goes from 2 or 3 all the way to 9 or 10. You got huge redox gradients, dissolved oxygen concentrations. Dissolved inorganic carbon concentrations go from almost nothing to supersaturation within a period of, you know, 10 to 15 minutes. So I think we need to do a better job at quantifying those variations in that upper layer, and what role does that play in the bulk fluxes that we're measuring from sediments. And I would make a plea that we need a lot more measurements, especially for things like primary production and these diurnal diel dynamics in the upper 2 millimeters of illuminated sediments, especially on the shelves. about 50 meters or so. Okay, that's it.
Do you see, or have you measured like benthic denitrification in your sediment, if they're illuminated and shallow?
I have not.
Or any bubbles?
Others have done that.
Uh-huh.
Mostly my familiarity is with intertidal sediments and salt marshes.
Yeah.
And they have measured denitrification rates, and as you would expect, it varies all over the place depending on, what's there.
If you are next, please stand at the front so you're ready to move forward while the person before you is talking.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jay. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, so I'm Chris, coming from Geomar Kiel in Germany. And so I'm a global biogeochemical modeler. So, when I work basically with coarse resolution and intermediate complexity computationally efficient models, and what I've kind of done in the past is plug in these benthic fluxes basically to see how they affect the large scale biogeochemistry and kind of global productivity. And so, this is kind of the take home point from the webinar I gave, that was a few months ago now for this group. And so where I compare some model simulations, which control here, which has looking at an iron sedimentary flux, which is essentially not sensitive to oxygen, comparing to this Dale et al. Parameterization, which has an iron release that's very sensitive to oxygen. And what happens when I then run a kind of an anthropogenic scenario from 1900 to 2050, when you have this increasing deoxygenation, then you get an increase in sedimentary iron release, right? Which then increases productivity because iron is a limiting nutrient in the model. Right, but something we also have to think about is the scavenging. And what happens is that we're getting all this extra iron release, but actually the vast majority of it, in this simple model is actually getting scavenged and not actually reaching the surface. So this is why we get a little increase in productivity, but actually most of it doesn't reach the surface, which is a big challenge, I think, going forward with the iron. And, yeah, do I do this myself? Yeah. And so I have a new project now, which has just started, and I just took this kind of cartoon from this Radix study. And so this is actually where I want to get the model eventually. Of course, you can't do everything in 3 years, but but the main point I think that we're still missing from thinking about the iron cycle is, we get a lot of this reductive release that I think we can parameterize relatively well. But this is also kind of building upon what Lisa was mentioning, is that there's a lot of scavenging and then going back, and then this kind of resuspension both occurring on the, I think on the margins, the slope, and also from the hydrothermal vents, and actually, getting getting this kind of coupling and like this intense scavenging and then possible re-release is also something I'm going to be looking at. And also what I hope is to implement the isotopes to then just actually get a better, to try to further constrain, because the reductive has this very strong isotopic signature, which is very negative compared to these other non-reductive. So that's kind of what I'm looking to do in this next few years with the benthic ion release. Yeah.
That's next slide. Is this?
Oh.
Hi all, I'll present my PhD project. Raroma Lagoon is a hypersaline lagoon in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Its area, it's about 220 square kilometers. It's presents high concentration of carbonate and phosphorus limited. The anthropic impacts occur since the 70s have led to change in the from microphytobentic algae to phytoplanktonic production in 2005. And then a lot of negative events have occurred in the lagoon. And the particular motivation for my thesis were the different turbidities between 2009 and 2022 occurring in the lagoon. And the approach of the thesis was identify the descriptors of traffic, and we call these different transparencies traffic crisis, And we identified the descriptors of traffic prices using the 9 water sample campaigns in the 11 points here, surface and bottom. Then from campaign 5 to 9, we collect a segment to determine nutrient fluxes. And finally, in campaign 9, it's green here. We used a device that we developed to filtrate the phytoplankton, the local phytoplankton, to understand the eutrophication sources and to get a better environmental management. I will talk a little bit about the results. Turbidity conditions present SEC at most 1 meter, while non-turbidity conditions about 4 meters depth, SEC. Salinity, turbidity, and temperature were the physical parameters that describe this trophic rise. And among many other parameters, we identified those 4 chemical parameters in water column. And the nutrient fluxes, in this case, nitrogen and phosphorus, were the opposite. The turbidity campaign had a opposite behavior in non-turbidity campaigns. The nitrogen and phosphorus was, NOx and ammonium were higher in turbidity campaigns, while they are smaller in non-turbidity. And the phytoplankton data, we together with all this quantification, we compare the values in sewage and sediment, the sewage from water treatment plants data, and nitrogen was more important for the source as a source in the sewage, while the sediment gave us a higher phosphorus stock. For this project, my challenges and opportunities is because we have a global warming, so it enhances the primary production, and here higher temperatures have led to also higher cell density. Diffusive fluxes, as Professor had said, the first 10 millimeters depth that I think that are important because the high variation of oxy reduction potential, especially for nitrogen forms. Total fluxes, because I just measured the diffusive fluxes, but I understand that all fluxes could be important. I would like to work with isotope profile to understand in sediment the differences, if there were a point that I could see the difference between Benway microalgae that existed before and after the phytoplankton, and anything else you can help me with ideas, I'll be glad. Thank you.
Lisa?
Hi, I'm Lisa Levin from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I'm a benthic ecologist. So I wanted to raise the issue of marine carbon dioxide removal. Many probably may be familiar with that the IPCC reports recently have argued that to reach the climate goals of the Paris Agreement, that we need to actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this has led to a burgeoning set of startups, basically a new industry with a lot of different technologies to remove carbon using the ocean and to use the deep ocean as the carbon repository. And this is because carbon is supposedly below 1,000 meters, will stay out of the atmosphere once it's down there for 100 or 200 or more years, depending on which part of the ocean you're in. So there are a whole series of different technologies proposed. They include ocean fertilization and artificial upwelling to stimulate phytoplankton production, which ultimately sinks to the deep ocean. There is macroalgal cultivation and sinking, crop and wood waste disposal. There's ocean alkalinity enhancement. There's active liquid CO2 injection into under the deep sea floor. So all of these would bring various forms of carbon down to the seafloor in the form of phytodetritus or macroalgae or wood waste or crop waste. Or in the case of alkalinity enhancement, it involves dumping millions of tons of powdered olivine or carbonates, or sending liquid CO2 down. And of course, there are many ecosystem implications for both the water column and the seafloor. And we have natural analogs in some cases. We have studied kelp falls. We know animals come. We have natural wood falls. We know animals colonize wood. We have natural CO2 vents. We know it changes the ecosystems. And next slide, please. I wanted to suggest that the benthic community, both the ecologists and the biogeochemists, have a lot of work that's already been done that can inform on what happens, the fate of carbon in these interventions, but also a lot of work that could be done, and also that we need to think about how to scale up. So for example, for decades now, we've been doing phytodetritus labeling experiments. And also we have time series like at Station M that tells us the fate of phytodetritus and who uses it. But the labeling experiments have allowed us to look at the fate of dissolved versus particulate organic carbon, to partition out the use by or uptake by microbes versus protozoa versus animals. We have looked at the different types of input, diatoms versus coccoliths and their fates, the seasonality of the responses, the effect of depths or oxygen on the responses, the roles of ecosystem engineers, species-specific feeding behaviors. But I have to say that even though there have been a lot of presentations about these technologies and carbon deposition, basically nobody's talking about what happens to the carbon once it reaches the bottom, and we need to be talking about this. There's a whole series of wood experiments that have been carried out over last few decades, and even in our lab, we know that depth affects what happens to wood. We know that oxygen affects it, methane seepage affects it, the type of wood matters, how far offshore you are matters. We know that there are wood colonizers like Xylophaga that prepare the way for other specialist wood species like the little amphoretid I've shown here. People have studied algal responses and the fate of, and are starting to study the fate of naturally occurring sargassum blooms. But of course, more could be done. Some have studied sedimentation responses, like we might get with alkalinity enhancement using volcanic ash analogs, but nobody's been actually drawing the parallels between all our past work and these new technologies and the applications at scale, which would be enormous. We really don't know what happens if you cover a city-sized area with algae or wood or CO2. And Bari did a whole bunch of CO2 injection experiments 20 years ago. Nobody's talking about those, but there's talk now about and people are starting to inject CO2 subsurface. And then there's a lot of work.
I hate to cut you off, but your 5 minutes is up.
Okay. Oh, can I say one more thing? That we can label methane now, and understanding that is revealed that all sorts of animals can use methane that we never, ever expected on the seafloor. Sorry.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna talk about the results from the regional ocean biodiversity model that we are using at UCLA for the Pacific Ocean at 25-kilometer resolution, and the video here showing the dissolved iron concentration at 200 meters. And you can see clearly there are several hotspots of iron being transported from the coastal area along the east coast of the Pacific to the open ocean. For example, in the North Pacific, Equatorial Pacific, and ETSV Eastern Tropical South Pacific, and also along the west, the coast of Japan as well. And that brings us to several questions. First, are there any observations that really confirm this preferential horizontal ion transport pathway? And the figure here showing here is from the cruise along of the coast of Oregon from Alexis Probak and Talia Evans in 2021. That's really showing ion plumes at 200 meters along from the coastal area to the open ocean. And I think it's really important because at the end of the day, you have to have circulation that brings ion from magnetic fluxes from the coastal area to the open ocean, where usually we have primary productivity is being ion limited. And also, how do we understand the mechanisms behind this preferential horizontal ion transport pathway? So for the project of the coast of Oregon model results and also observation really confirm that ion from coastal areas is being released from reductive magnetic sediments, and ion being transported by Ekman transport, also by eddies and meanders. That the variation of ocean circulation in the time scale less than one month, and in the spatial scale less than 10 kilometers because of the interaction between ocean currents and bottom topography. But mechanism gonna be different between regions. For example, the project that we're focusing and showing in the vehicle here, focusing on the Oregon coast, California current, but how are the mechanisms gonna be different if we focus on the tropical Pacific, focus on the ETSP. And then like another point that I want to make is like really the biogeochemical physical interaction. For example, ion chemistry, for the model, most of the system model that I know focusing only on the dissolved ion, but dissolved ion from, but as speaker shown here from the samples of the coast of Oregon, we can see that really actually there is also another plume of particulate ion that being transported from the coastal areas to the open ocean. And usually particulate ion can act as sink of ion, because dissolved ion can be absorbed to the particulate, but also particulate can release ion along the transport pathway. So like particulate can either act as a source or a sink for ion. And we have to, it's a challenge for the model because we have to have particulate ion as a threshold in the model. And also, I also want to talk about ligand and particle production for biological processes like microbial. They're gonna produce ligand when they have ion, being ion limited to protect ion from being scavenged. And another point that I want to emphasize here, there are a lot of focuses here on biochemical processes, but I think I would love to have a conversation about with physical oceanographer. I am not a physical oceanographer, but I learned a lot about the physical oceanography processes that transport ion from the coastal area to the open ocean, not just the mean circulation, but like the Ekman transport, but like eddies and meanders, like variation in time, that variation because of topography. And that requires like measure chemical and biological and physical processes at the same time at different spatial and temporal scales. And in order to do that, I think the important thing is that we have to talk in between different communities. One of the things that I love meeting people in the Southern California with Alexis Probak and Talia Evans is like we can, as a model, we can form observationalists about the regions that maybe have a hotspot of transport, and they really go there and they confirm our hypothesis. And then like that's the back and forth between model results and observations of the figure and the video on the first slide that I'm showing. And another model that you can follow is like the geotraces community and biogeoscape, when they really measure the flux of concentration of dissolved trace metal, but they focusing more now on the processes and the flux, and looking at talking with biology about the microbial ion demand and trace metal demand. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, some of you have seen me floating around, but just to introduce myself, my name is Kayla Gillen. I'm actually an undergrad at Northeastern, working in Christina's lab full time. So I have, just to kind of go over the general what I've been working on, and then a lot of the challenges that I've been running into 3 months into this space. So I bring with me kind of a new perspective, but so I've been working on the trawling problem and trying to characterize trawling along the East Coast, most specifically in the Gulf of Maine, is where I'm looking. So to do this, I've been actually just
data mining basically, for the past few months and trying to compile, sediment data, ecosystem classifications, acoustics, as I'm showing here, and, in situ carbon measurements of the sediment. So, yeah, we heard Gabe talk a lot about this yesterday, but I'm trying to match in time acoustics done by NOAA and in situ measurements that we have. So this is a case study that I've done in Jeffrey's Ledge, which is in the Gulf of Maine. And these black points that you see here are in situ LOI measurements completed between 2002 and 2005. And I guess the main problems that I'm running into is compatibility between instrumentation. So these first measurements here are EK 500 data that isn't necessarily compatible with our model right now. And then post 2008, we make a sudden shift to this EK 60 model. So it really is just talking in between the different instruments that we have, as well as the availability of in situ data in the first place. I haven't really been able to identify much data post 2008 in this same location. So it is kind of just matching the data spatially and temporally. And I guess why this matters is I want to characterize trawling and how that's affecting the benthos, but I think overall it poses like a lot of larger questions for the community, which really is, I am telling you something you already know because this is really the main reason why we're all here, but I want to know like where else should we be looking? Who else here is looking into this? Are there other people that I should be talking to? And then when we are conducting interdisciplinary research, how do we kind of collate all of this information, which again is what we are doing here. So I'm looking at sediment type, ecosystem abundance. This is interpolated sediment type on the East Coast. And then this is ecosystem abundance from NOAA bottom trawling surveys. And as you can see, there's some weird spikes as in the 90s, we just start adding in random species that we're looking at. So it's kind of like moving between different standards and using a common language to combine all of these things. And then are we missing any mechanisms? Should I be looking at something else? Should I be, layering something else? And then I guess in the end, when working with models, how do I decide how many in situ points is enough to validate a model in the first place? How do we, which I get, again, is another point that we've all been making. How do we connect observations with models? Thank you.
Hi, I want to draw your attention to another macronutrient that we haven't talked about much during this session, and that's silica. Now, just to remind you, silicon is the second most abundant element in the Earth's crust, and it's really coupled to carbon in many different ways. On the terrestrial side, silicate mineral weathering is this long-term control on atmospheric CO2. And in the marine side, I know this is a busy slide, so just focus on the first panel. Silicon is an obligate nutrient for diatoms, which is a group of phytoplankton responsible for 15 to 18% of global climate production. It's also a major substrate that comprises export production, so sequestering CO2 from the surface ocean to the deep ocean. So now once it enters the seabed, there's this tension in the community about what happens to the silica frustral. In this traditional model, we just think, okay, well, most of it dissolves and it's fluxed out of sediment into the water column where it can be available again as a nutrient. But now there's a preponderance, I think, of evidence that shows it can undergo diagenetic alteration at the sediment water interface and continue to participate in all of these other biogeochemical cycles. For example, it's been proposed as a sink for iron. And also it continues to interact with the carbon cycle through these diagenetic reaction pathways where you're sequestering or consuming alkalinity and producing CO2. So you're also affecting the pH of the ocean, most likely in coastal zones. So the data I'm presenting just quickly about what tropical cycles or major seabed perturbation does to the benthic silica cycle. And if there are just two points that you could get out of this slide, is just focus on the blue curves. This is a pore water profile of silica before, 2 weeks before, a category 4 hurricane moved over our sites. And this blue solid curve is pore water profile 1 year after the hurricane that demonstrates that your benthic silica cycle doesn't go back to kind of these T0 conditions, even 12 months after that hurricane moves through the site. And also the 2 sites are really different profiles. I mean, you generally don't get maxima in dissolved silica profiles. You usually see something that's like this hypothetical dashed black line where you just have like this ingrowth that is consistent with this traditional model. But instead, the maxima tends to show that there's another reaction pathway that's happening with the dissolved silica cycle, and it could be like a formation of these aluminosilicate phases. You can see here. The other interesting thing that we found with our data is that the stable silicon isotope measurements also demonstrate that there are these additional reactions that silica undergoes, and these are dissolved pore water profiles where you have this 1 to 2 permeable difference that shows that it continues to react once it's in the seabed. So the questions that I generally have, first of all, you have this disconnect between the way the carbon responds to extreme events versus the silica response. So the questions, bigger questions that I have is that how do we couple carbon to other nutrient cycles? Because we have this delayed time lag, which goes back to this question of resilience. But these extreme events also affect the recycling efficiency and burial efficiency of silica, which is going to impact your silicon to, for example, nitrogen ratios in the water column. And when those vary, you are going to have things like a preponderance of halves, for example. It's going to be dependent on the silicon to nitrogen ratio. So then if they're so connected, how do we incorporate these reactions when we're looking at climate models, forecasting, timecasting? We're coupling silicon to carbon. And if you notice those 2 sites, they are just about 60 kilometers apart, 40 nautical miles. How do you upscale heterogeneity? They're in very different profiles. One showed a flux of silica out of sediment, whereas one demonstrated that it could be a flux of silica into sediment. So how do we include also climate variability and some major perturbations that are going to be more typical of coastal settings? Thanks.
Panchal Maiti, Louisiana State University. So I'll start with some definition. So we're talking about oxygen consumption in the sediment. So we have what we call the total oxygen utilization, or TOU. That is what a standard incubation or lander gives you, is the total amount of oxygen taken out due to diffusion and biological activity. And then we have what we call DOU, or diffusive oxygen utilization, which are these beautiful profiles. This profile is done in situ at 200 micron interval at the sea floor. And you set up the gradient. This is the sediment water interface. You get the gradient of oxygen, and you can calculate your diffusive oxygen flux. In theory, they should be equal, and they are often equal if you're in the deep ocean where there is very little biology. But if you're in the coast, in the shallow shelf, there's a lot of biology, and they do not tend to converge. And the difference is what the biological processes are imparting to the carbon mineralization. And we can see globally, about 60% of the TOU can be represented by DOU, which means 40% of the carbon that is being utilized at the sediment water interface is from biology. So that was the basic idea. And what we wanted to do is, okay, should be super important in the shelf. We have shown that, but there's very little data where you can concurrently measure these two together, because you need these 2 different sets of instruments, the lander, and you need this microprofiler. This is my favorite ADV to get some physics too. And so what we thought is, what about hypoxic zones, where the biology is supposed to be very low, and there we should expect these to converge. And there's another reason to do this, because most of the hypoxia models that are coupled with benthic models and the ROMs on the top, they assume there's very little biology, and they use a DOU to drive that model.
So that was the other reason to do this. One, does biology really matter in hypoxic zone, whether it's very little oxygen? Two, does this model which are using just DOU are doing a good job or not? So we went out and did this work 2 years in the hypoxia zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The red area is the hypoxia where the bottom water is less than 2. And here is the data. Blue is our TOU, total oxygen. This color, I forgot what color, purple, each is your DOU. And the numbers are the oxygen penetration depth, 2 millimeter, 2.8 millimeter. So if you look at that, except for this one station in those 2 years, TOU was always higher than DOU, meaning biology is important in driving a lot of this oxygen. And actually, I was glad we had this talk yesterday because I went with this preconceived notion that I had done enough sampling in this area and I never found macrofauna in these sediments. So I was expecting them to be about similar. But then when I saw them to be different, we realized there's a lot of these small worms in these sediments like polychaetes and nematodes, which can be really important, and we often do not give them enough emphasis. But yesterday's talk, we saw that they can be important. And I think that is what this is reflecting. Maybe these small worms, their bioirrigation does matter. And also future models should include TOU rather than DOU to drive the bottom oxygen. And we can see when I compare them with other deltas, there's very little data. There's only 2 more studies, Rhone and Congo, where they have done this concurrently. We can see Gulf of Mexico, in spite of the hypoxia, does have a big difference. So it actually does matter. So that's it.
Oh, my name is Hang Yin from Texas A&M Corpus Christi. So I'm going to talk about the evaporation effect in lagoonal estuaries. So this discussion is driven by the observation that sometimes you measure the salinity, you will find that salinity can be very high, up to 60 or 70. That is due to evaporation, and also the evaporation will affect our interpretation about the other parameters. Here, it's an example I give is the TA. So here is a model, very simple 200-member mixing model. And the people regard as the delta T here, if it's above the mixing line, we call it the production, and below it is consumption. And here is the explicit expression of the salinity. We call it this is calculated based on the mixing, and also this is the salinity TA calculated based on the mixing, and also add a reaction term here. The problem for evaporation is the fresh water in the member TA is not always like 0. Sometimes it can be couple hundred micromole, or even a couple thousand micromole. And the evaporation changed the relationship between salinity and the TA following this blue dotted line. So actually it will move the point based on the mixing to this gray data point. And if you don't consider evaporation effect, basically you can tell there is a enrichment of TA relative to the theoretical mixing line, and you call it production, but there's no production involved. And in this case, the TA and the salinity expressions can be expressed as this one. I include the E, which is the evaporation factor, to help you understand it. For example, if you're like 50% fresh water evaporate, E is equal to 2, because both salinity and the TA get concentrated 2 times. So the third scenario is if there is evaporation and reaction happens at the same time. So this is a data point based on the mixing, and evaporation moves this data point to this gray data point, and then there is biogeochemical cycling you measured here. So actually you need to calculate the delta TA star, which is here, this range instead of this range, to tell the alterations based on the biogeochemical processes. And in this case, the expression or mathematical expression of salinity and TA observation TA can be expressed either this one or either this one. So I include the E, which is evaporation factor. So the problem is how we calculate the E. So I include alpha here. Alpha means a percentage of freshwater evaporation, which I use evaporation rate and also the residence time of the effluents and also the surface area, but it gets canceled on both the top and the bottom of this equation. And sometimes the effluents have very long residence time. So here is an example where I come from, Corpus Christi. Here are a couple of effluents, and here is a list of the effluents with different residence time from a year to a couple months or a couple days. And you use this residence time, and if you know the evaporation rate, you can calculate the alpha and then the E. The challenge here is, for example, this is a 2D residence time model in Galveston Bay, which is here. So actually it shows spatial and also temporal variations of the residence time. The color here indicates from 0 to 45 days. So it all depends on where you are and then you collect sample, and you will get a different residence time, and then you will get a different alpha and then different E. So it makes very challenging to figure out what's the biogeochemical alterations on your TA data or on your DSA data. Okay, thank you.
Cool. I'm Heidi. I am working in Miami right now on coral reef biogeochemistry modeling. And right now I'm focused on building a model for nearshore reefs in the Florida Keys here. So I'm just gonna give an overview of the model input that I'm using. And then hopefully that could lead to some discussions on what might be better or if this is all right. And the QR codes will take you to each of these data sources if you want to learn more. So first, I'm trying to predict carbonate chemistry. So that's intricately tied to both our hydrodynamics and benthic composition, driving the sign and magnitude of the changes in the chemical parameters. So I'm focused on 4 different subregions of the Florida Keys, from Biscayne Bay down to the lower Keys. This data was recently synthesized in a publication in December, if you want to learn more about what that looks like over the last decade or so. And one of the things I've thought a lot about is how to summarize data appropriately from a spatial point of view, like what benthic habitat is acting on this water mass to change its chemistry. So I'm working with a slim 2D hydrodynamic model for South Florida to define these zones of influence. I'm calling them bow ties because a lot of them end up looking like bow ties when I look at the backward trajectories and forward trajectories. That's these 7 polygons back are like 1 day, 2 day, 3 days, however many days you want to look back at where that water mass had been before sampling at a particular site. So I'm doing that for all of our discrete sampling points. And then I cut available habitat maps by those polygons to find out the relevant habitat index acting on that water mass. Right now I'm using maps from the Florida Unified Reef Map, which is kind of the best available spatial map for the region. But as you can see, it's limited, it has gaps. It's also combining data from all time, from what I can tell. So somebody measured something in one area in 1 year, somebody measured it in a different year, they put it all together into one Frankenstein map. But I spatially cut that by those polygons. So here's an example of like 7 days. This is long key, but the 7-day polygon versus 1 day and the different kind of habitat you might be considering as influencing those chemical signals. Also as input parameters, which happy to talk about more later, I'm using some nutrient data, volume, light availability, temperature, salinity, and various time parameters. And then the challenge I want to hit on is something I've been thinking about a lot as well, is what the relevant end member chemistry is to consider for each of those sample points. So I have this hydrodynamic model to lean on. This is showing a particular sampling site here and looking back 7 days at the Lagrangian particle trajectories leading to that. This is all backward data, so it's colored by what side of the keys it's spent time in, because I'm trying to get at the relative proportion of time spent on the Gulf side of the Florida Keys versus the Atlantic side, to then appropriately weight end members. Because historically, when we look at the reef chemistry in this area, people typically just compare it to the oceanic sampling sites on the Atlantic side. So when they're looking at deltas, they're looking at the change just along those transect points. So I'm looking for other sources of data that'll give me relevant end member chemistry above the keys on the Gulf side. I found two transects to do that. And then by using the proportion of time that the trajectories spend on either side of the keys, I'm weighing the appropriate end members. So the circles here are the end member chemistry north of the keys or on the Gulf side. And these triangles are those oceanic sites. You can see there's a lot less seasonal variability in those, which makes sense because they're in the Florida current and just like rushing through. And then my potential input end member chemistry falls along these lines based on the proportion of time that water is spending on each of those zones. I don't know that this is the way to go. It's a way that seems to kind of address some of these issues. I'm also relatively new to modeling and my background is in situ deployments. So very open to any ideas or suggestions and happy to have conversations about this. Thanks.
Krista?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I've already insisted on that part during the workshop, but I'd like to come back to these event-driven processes. I think are important for early diagenesis in surface sediments. And well, most of us think that it's more related to so this event-driven deposition are more related to the coastal ocean, but it's also true on prominent. I will not probably have time to give a lot of examples on that, but it's also important for the deep ocean also. We know that the event-driven processes in the coastal ocean at least, but not only, represent major transport of sediments in these margin systems. So I give some examples here. I don't know if you see my mouse here, but it's of some flood deposition here in the Rhone River Delta, that's in the Mediterranean Sea, in the south of France. But there's also in the canyons at the western part of this Gulf of Lions, there's also a large export of particles that export as much particles that are input by the river, and that deposit a large amount of sediment at the bottom of this canyon. And this is related to a very short time scale, so that means very large deposition of sediments. Here we are talking in the delta itself, we're talking about maybe 20 or 30 centimeters of sediment that are deposited at once. And so it gives an idea of the disruption of early diagenesis that arise with that. So the question that are raised is the fate of particulate carbon during this event. Of course, this particulate carbon is both buried, but also made available to the microbe for recycling. What's the carbon mass balance at the local to the shelf slope scale? So how does that work? And also the evolution of this with the climate and human change, because we know that these processes, these export processes, are linked to climate change. I don't have time to really go into the details, but like the floods are depending on the intensity of the hydrological cycle, as much as the export that is linked also to special conditions also in the deep sea. Next slide, please. So I think, yes, next slide. Yes, thank you. So I think we need to build new tools for observing and modeling these events. So this afternoon, we will have some talks about Stanley Moore that will probably talk about this. So Yeah, we've made some work on trying to identify and measure and follow, monitor these events and the changes in the sediment composition and sediment and pore water composition that follow with using a benthic station. I was referring to that in the discussion we had this morning. And we used a benthic station that is equipped with the micro electrode. You can see that here. And so they are able to monitor the oxygen distribution in pore waters at the top of the sediment. So that's one way to go. There are several other ways that we could use. There are also some crawler that can go around and measure fluxes also over time. And at the same time, we have developed several models for representing the sediment. The first one that we did was dealing with resuspension. That was a Moriarty et al. 2018. And more recently, we developed this flood deposition model that is in More et al. 2022. So I think the take-home message is these events are important in the coastal and the deep ocean, at least for the sloop part of the deep ocean. And we should really go on and build new tools. Some of that I showed are there already, but we should continue on going on building these new tools to really study them with caution. And that's it. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shay Ajayi. I'm a postdoc at Penn State. And so I'm working in the Chesapeake Bay, and I'm trying to look at different environmental variables that predict where the benthos are concentrated within the bay. And so I'm working with a couple of long-term monitoring program data sets. And so on the left column, that's a Chesapeake long-term benthic monitoring program data. I use data from 1995 to 2022. And so every summer they collect a benthic grab, and I'm using biomass data, the ash free dry weight from each grab. And they also take a few other variables. It takes salinity, water temperature, dissolved oxygen, total depth, and the sand percentage. And so those measurements are taken concurrently with the benthic grab. But I also wanted to utilize other data that's collected within the bay. And so on the right column, that's from another program called the Water Quality Monitoring Program. And you see there's an extended list of variables that I want to correlate to the benthic data. And so in terms of challenges with working with these data sets, there's so much spatial variability within the bay, and the locations of the water quality measurement is not always, I mean, it's never at the same location as the BMP measurements. So we want to be able to understand how to correlate these variables and interpolate the data from the water quality measurements to be able to link these environmental variables to the benthos. And so for the water quality measurements on the right, we used averaged data. So for instance, for chlorophyll, we looked at chlorophyll concentrations of the surface, and we looked at an average of the 9 or 10 months previous to when the benthic grab was collected. And so we're looking at what kind of conditions were the benthos experiencing before we measured them in the sediment. Okay, so we use generalized additive models, or GAMs, to isolate the effects of different variables on the benthic fauna biomass response. So we're looking at, for instance, if you look at this plot for dissolved oxygen, it's looking at how does dissolved oxygen, and that dissolved oxygen was collected concurrently with the benthic grabs, how does it affect the overall biomass? And the biomass is on a log scale. And so you can see for this plot, you can see for dissolved oxygen, once you go beneath about 2 milligrams per liter, you can see that the biomass drops off, which is what you'd expect. And so you can see the strong effect that dissolved oxygen is having on biomass. Another important predictor that influences the biomass density is salinity. So if you look at salinity at the surface of the waters, a lot of the biomass is concentrated at lower salinities. You have bivalves such as Rangia and Corbicula, which have low salinity tolerances between 0 and 5 ppt. And so you can see that GAMS is picking up those salinity tolerances within these bivalves. And then we also wanted to look at primary production to see how that influences the benthos. And so we looked at chlorophyll to service the water in the 10 months previous when the benthic grab was collected to see if, you know, for instance, a spring bloom would produce a bunch of organic matter that would sink to the bottom and feed the benthos. And so if you, so some of those results are still inconclusive, but you can see for this plot for chlorophyll, at the most extreme values, you have a lot more uncertainty because you have less data points that have those chlorophyll values. But you can see there's a peak here around 20 micrograms per liter. And then once you go above that peak, you have biomass dropping off, and that could be the effects of eutrophication where the higher chlorophyll concentrations could be linked with also really low dissolved oxygen. And so it ends up being detrimental to the benthos. But those are some of the results we're still trying to interpret. And like I said before, the greatest challenge is that when you're using these two different monitoring program data sets, being able to use the best method to be able to correlate or to interpolate spatially to make sure that you're comparing things accurately. So yeah, thank you.
Do we have time for a question?
Yeah.
So why does biomass drop off with pH? That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, so on the bottom panel here, these are basically showing how many data points that you have at that pH. And so you can see where it's dropping off. You have less data points. And so those are one of the things that we're still trying to work out to make sure we're not making stuff up.
I thought maybe that's like some sort of proxy for productivity, and therefore carbon deposition, but maybe it's just not enough data.
Yeah, that's
Okay. Pretty impressive.
We also had a question for Anne from Christoph on benthic iron. Are we able to measure benthic iron influx with in situ benthic chambers?
Yeah, maybe Italia is the best approach to answer that question because I got data from you, but I think I know from the project that the people are working with it, the way that people measure iron in the California current is they are using benthic chambers. So you want to add?
One of the stations in the figure provided, station 31, is the UMPA depth center, which overlaps with Sorbonel 2010's benthic chamber iron flux measurements. We also had parameters group out there, which looked at that flux with some pores and with a syringe sampler on top of the sediment as well, which hopefully I was told to take that manuscript last week to look over, but I have not yet. So
There's also a paper that was published in the last year or so. I think Bob Allard's the first author in marine chemistry, where they were looking at all the challenges and difficulties in measuring benthic iron fluxes. So if you really want to know at least what Bob and his group are thinking about with measuring iron fluxes, I would say go look at that paper.
So now we have some time before lunch to do a broad group discussion on what are the take-home messages here? What's the point we're trying to make? How do we move forward? What are the challenges and opportunities? And try to narrow down to 5. It's an arbitrary number, like picked it, but it seems reasonable. So you all should have access to this document on the folder. I try to synthesize some of the discussions here. Maybe we should do a little bit of a report back from the earlier discussions today. Just does anyone want to talk for the time space scales other than me? I feel like I'm getting enough talking time here. Dan?
Sure. So I think that what we focused on was you know, how we needed to have more time, like, you know, kind of, you know, observed, right? And the ways that we could do that, but that there was different needs depending on where you were at, and that the variability is more comes to the coast, and if you move into the deep ocean, that you might, you know, the scale variability differs, and so kind of the time resolution and challenges exist differently in these places. The challenges to observing and the needs are different in these places. And so one idea that we kind of talked about potentially to address this would be to try and augment, or to try and find some, like, so the hydrographic community repeatedly occupies, you know, certain lines and locations in order to kind of try and capture, you know, kind of the time variability and to different degrees. So coastal waters have more reoccupations than deep ocean, you know, sites. And so kind of modeling after that, could we augment some existing observational, you know, kind of cruises and assets that exist, you know, with additional benthic monitoring in order to try and address this need, right, that we have as a community. And so I spoke a little bit about like some of the things we're trying to work on within NOAA. They have the Ocean Certification Program regularly monitors the large marine ecosystems with coastal cruises every 3 to 5 years, and we've been working to try and augment those cruises with coring, and have shown successfully that we've been able to do so without slowing down the cruise, right? Which has been a concern that many of you may know and have experienced yourselves. And so in New England and also in Southeast and in the Gulf of Mexico, they were able to also take some course as well. So they have full water column with plankton tows, as well as then now the matching benthic, which is nice for the coastal communities, and who are looking to publicize that so that other opportunities that exist in other areas can also try and do similar approaches. We talked about some of the long-term observing sites that exist around and how we might be able to augment those, you know what I mean, with additional maybe time series monitoring and other robotics, you know, that could be and then that sort of like as an approach. And then were there other things?
The isotopes.
Oh, yes, isotopes. We spent some time talking about the need to, and connection with the land, right? That there was this, the need to consider how we think about the monitoring all the way from land, you know, into sea, to kind of connect with the resources.
There was also the standardized set of variable from Goose.
Oh, yes.
That was.
Yeah, that there is like a standardized set people haven't heard, and there's a, as part of the UN decade, there's multiple opportunities to kind of engage with the standardized set of variables that Goose is working on, which also includes a deep sea specific group and some benthic observations as well. And so there's like a list that's available that we can maybe circulate as well, like necessary variables that you can contribute to if you think that that yours are not there. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So we I was thinking about the list of variables. So sorry. So we had a great session, I think. We started out with this idea of trying to find coastal versus open ocean. And so we had like a brainstorming session where we basically just threw out how we feel about this, what we define as coastal versus open ocean. And we quickly came to the conclusion that that was very anecdotal and probably not that helpful. And Nick suggested we take a look at this really helpful paper that helped define the differences between ponds and lakes. And they did it using data. So they basically were looking at like a functional definition for ponds and lakes. And so we quickly turned to that as like where we should hopefully go at some point, where we could really maybe look at things like versus, you know, data versus depth or light penetration or sediment type or something like that, and then do some breakpoint analyses to actually see if our anecdotal feelings about definitions of coastal versus open ocean would be matched by available data. And then we spent a good deal of time kind of brainstorming what variables we thought we could look at, as well as potential different data sources that might be readily available to do that kind of analysis. We briefly thought and talked a little bit about other types of definitions that are out there, including our favorites, marine ecosystems of the world, also known as MEOW. But these were all, really, most of them that are currently out there are very biological based. And so we were pretty excited that this is maybe an opportunity to define coastal versus open ocean and potentially various definitions within that, you know, driven by like the functions of benthic biogeochemistry. What I do, you want to add things?
Lisa.
Great.
Yeah, she was just adding essential ocean variables that might have been previous ones.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so
Hopefully she included the link so you can put that in the document.
It's in there.
Yes,
Okay, good.
Heather got it.
Okay, so, making this, I think, a little bit. We're done. So this is a list I got from just browsing through the posters and my own recollection post dinner. Of some of the challenges, opportunities that came up more than once. So I think a clear winner here is bottom boundary flow that came up like a lot, both in the morning and in the afternoon and in multiple breakout groups. But yeah, I want this to be an open conversation. What do you think is important? What are the take home messages here? Like, what are we? How do we move forward when we want to say like, this is what I want to do? Like, what's the argument here that we need to make?
I'd love to be able to add some other processes on here, like nitrogen cycling is not in here at all. And I think one of the things that would be neat to highlight is like the coupling of, which I keep hearing, is the coupling of these processes and how, you know, we've got to figure out a way to like, what's the rate we measure that will help us understand those couplings, or how do we better get different process rate measurements? In addition to carbon, which is obviously really important in all the carbon fluxes, but I'm trying to like silica fluxes being really important to help us try to understand carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling. Nitrogen fluxes are going to be important to that end too. So I'd like us, I don't know, I'd like somewhere to be able to have some more explicit language about understanding the process, the connections between these different rates.
If you feel like adding that, the document is available.
What is that?
If you feel like adding that, please do.
Yeah, where
It's
do we
on
add
the,
this?
it's on the folder, there's.
Yeah, it's a little hard to find.
So if you didn't think that.
Yeah, there's the BECS agenda participant list that you all should have access to.
Is it in breakout? I only know.
It's before the breakout.
Before the breakouts.
I just had to refresh it.
So I'm gonna be provocative, and say that if we're really trying to limit it to 5 really important things, I would cross a lot of those things off the list. I mean, I love sulfate reduction. I've studied it in and out in lots of different places but I don't know that in the biggest, or methane release. I don't even know that in just picking on those two. I don't think that important in terms of great unknowns, and even bottom boundary flow. It sounds, it's important, but I mean, how can I put this? We're not physical oceanographers, and I think it's bottom boundary flow in the context of what we're interested in carbon. Fate of carbon in the benthic boundary layer, well, that's sort of like motherhood and apple pie. One I would add, because we've heard a lot about it, and I think the chemistry gets really complicated, is iron. You know, sediments as a source of iron, but what does that mean? We've heard about sediment resuspension and sediment redox chemistry, and I got to admit, when I see modelers that put, I don't want to pick on modelers, but when I see modelers that look at iron, the first question is, well, what does iron mean to you? Because what iron means to a modeler versus what iron means to somebody who makes measurements of iron in sediments is maybe very different. So I think that some of these are good, but you know, we got an arrow to 5. Let's go for the big guns.
Yeah, I mean, actually, kind of following up on what David said, I also think if you start thinking about these individual processes, they're doable. They're not really challenging. The challenge is the ability to do most of them at the same time, at the same point.
Yeah, so we can do that.
Right,
Yeah.
yes, so, and I think that's where our challenges should lie, because individually, in this room, probably if we combine our effort, we can do most of these, right?
Yeah.
But maybe not doing at the same time, same point.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that.
I thought, something we talked about a lot was oxygen fluxes that I saw it in a lot of places, but that would be like your first order. Your first order pass at getting at a lot of these other reactions, that if we have your oxygen measurement or DOU, right? DOU versus TOU, but DOU, then you can at least constrain carbon remineralization rates, which would then constrain nitrogen.
Yeah,
Maybe
everyone
desire,
should
like
read,
just like the
everyone
first
should read the Jorgensen et al.
Oh,
paper,
yeah, that's
the review article, because that is just a brilliant synthesis of where we're at with that, and it would be a brilliant, and that's the start, for oxygen, that's the place to start. Yes. It's all there, everything that's been done more or less is there, and that's where that's how we go forward. And Bo didn't pay me to say.
Dave, can you give us the reference for that? I'm not sure I saw that.
It's, yeah, science reviews.
Our science review, yeah.
Or
The
science
database is
review.
available, so you can
Yeah.
download it.
For science, yeah.
Well, I'll be real quick. So the other thing, just to go off of that provocative statement of things we could cut out. I don't know if like export production is our thing. Like, I feel like people are working on that. And I don't know if that's a big challenge for us. Maybe it is, but
Yeah, so that's the, I think the contest it was added is like, how much and what's the quality of things that are getting to the vendors? And that's the big one, so, I agree, a lot of these is just what came up from the discussions, we need to put it out there, but like, maybe more than cutting is like, how do we, put them together in a way that is more forward-looking, a little bit. So I think a lot of what these items reflect is like the influence of the Ventus is not isolated from the rest of the working group. We still need to understand fluxes, we still need to understand all of that, so what's the uncertainty that's causing if we don't know exactly what's happening? I think that's one reason. Syra and Christoph raised hands. Let's go through Olivia wants to say something, Damien, and then we'll go online.
Yeah, in the spirit of grouping points together, I was thinking that there are 4 on this list that to me ring like the same problem. Buffering for calcium carbonate dissolution, fate of carbon, harnessing how carbon burial works, and kind of export production. To me, the common denominator is those that we don't really understand how carbon, whether it is inorganic or organic, works and gets buried and reacts in the very top layer of the sediment. In my presentation about calcium carbonate, I stressed that it's really the most reactive phase that we don't understand simply because we can't catch them. We're lacking tools to reobserve those things. So for solutes, we know how to use macrosensors and we know how to have very precise depth gradient. But for anything related to the solids, I feel like we're really unable to know and to measure what happens in the top layer. So I would like to put really together here inorganic and organic carbon, even though they are really 2 different communities, because it's really the same problem. It's really the most reactive phases in those 2 groups that we don't understand, and that we need to study to finally understand how this very early, like top millimeter diagenesis works in those. So perhaps these 4 could be grouped in something like. Sorry?
did I highlight those right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would group them in something like a highly reactive solid carbon phases.
I think that the processing, the alkalinity flux. Is sort of also going to be intimately associated with a lot of the issues that you're talking about there. As well, and I think personally, that's a pretty important one because it's not well understood.
I'd like to put an exclamation point on that, and that all of this is related to blue carbon and carbon fluxes and carbon storage. And I think we really don't understand what the carbon dynamics are in shelf environments as well as the deep ocean. The shelf environments are going to be the first to be impacted because that's where most of the productivity is.
Which gets to the time and space scale issues.
So-
Because blue carbon burial is really a time and space scale, I would argue.
So Damien and then online.
I'll be quick. It feels like the big take home for me has been, how do we put the bio into biogeochemistry? I don't know if there's another place to lump things there, or maybe really call it eco-biogeochemistry. It just feels like a lot of the conversation, and I've looked at a lot of fluxes that someone had mentioned, let's not call them outliers, let's call them exceptions, but almost all the exceptions are because there's been some bioirrigation, some large polychaete tube that randomly was in one core and not in another core. So bioturbation has been discussed a lot, or at least in the groups that I've been in, and maybe that is the microbial communities and interactions between benthic communities, but if we're talking about how we can measure everything all at once, all the time, better incorporation of benthic ecology with these rates seems like that's a big take home for me. Not quite sure exactly how to do it, but yeah.
If folks online wanna unmute.
You want to go ahead? Christoph, you're ahead of me.
No, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. I guess what's missing for me in this current list, or I guess, I wasn't necessarily thinking of major challenges as what our informational gaps are, although I see where those overlap. But what's missing for me is the human dimension in this and the global change. So thinking about responses to geoengineering in this, in the current state that we're in, where there's very much an impetus to start doing that, and they are underway. So this is sort of reiterating what Lisa Levin has already said. And I'm currently missing a talk in our department right now about one of these experiments that was taking place in New York Harbor this past summer, I guess. As well as I guess this is related to the inorganic carbon dynamics here and the alkalinity fluxes, but in the context of the global climate change. And we could think of multiple pieces of that as separate, if we're thinking about, increasing CO2 and our lack of understanding. But you could also do it in multiple contexts where we're thinking of larger event-driven impacts. So, increases in hurricanes and what that means on the shelf and what this means for those, for resuspension or for slumping or for whatever or shoreline erosion even. So that those ends of it was missing for me. Thank you.
Oh.
Me? My turn? Okay. Well, I agree. One thing I agree with David is that the iron flux. I raised the question in the measuring the iron flux is definitely a challenge. So, and I like the way that they've put it, saying, well, okay, when you talk about modelers, there is flux of iron coming from the sediment, and then it's transported. But when you talk to people working on iron, they don't know exactly how it works. They don't know exactly how iron can leave the sediment, with what kind of ligands are needed there to have that iron soluble in conditions where it should not, and so on. So iron is definitely the flux of iron out of sediments. If it's so important for the iron transport, is definitely a challenge. Another thing that I also support is quite a bit differently than Olivier Sulpice put it, but I think the fate of carbonate and the interaction, of course, between carbonate and the early diagenesis, not only the oxic part of it, but the organic matter mineralization is also something very important. There's been a lot of work done on that, but I guess at least in the coastal ocean, that will be the first impacted. We heard that before. It's something that is probably also very important and very much more complex than we think. So and that's basically part of the smoothing of the CO2 perturbation, I would say, in the atmosphere. So we should really go on and take care of that and try and understand how it works, especially in the case of the CDR deposition, how this works when you will add alkalinity in the sediments, how this will react with all the things that are there. And so we should definitely look into that. The last point that I would really go on, because I think it's not well known, is the influence of these extreme events, especially in the coastal ocean. We know that there will be, and that's the coupling with the climate change also, there will be more and more of these extreme events, heat waves, hurricanes, large storms, large deposition events linked to floods and so on. So I think that we should also get a better understanding of that, of the importance of these processes on the way the sediment functions and the way the fluxes from the sediment to the water column also are affected. So these are, for me, the three main topics I would see out of this list. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think if we were to take a step higher of this list, I can see kind of 4 big points that a lot of this might be possible to include under. The first would just be like lack of mechanistic understanding. To me, kind of encompasses so much of this discussion on basic processes. The second could be like consideration of pulses and pressures. What is a pulse and what is a pressure, and how do we incorporate that moving forward when considering models and trying to consider scaling. The third could be linking processes. I think the fourth, and I'm not sure if it's up there yet, is an opportunity, is there is so much existing data. Like I think there's so much data out there already that most of these questions could be answered if there was somebody who had time to do it and go into that data. And I think that's an opportunity that we should absolutely include in this list.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges and opportunity kind of following up on it is, do we have a consensus on what is the appropriate spatial and temporal scale we need to sample to make it a representative study? And it would of course vary from region to region, but are there data sets which says, oh, we have enough, this is good enough for this area, or is it not? Maybe some areas have, some areas don't, but how do we actually say we have enough or don't have enough at a spatial and temporal scale needed to make it representative?
I just wanted to propose maybe an idea for consolidating a few things. So I definitely agree that a lot of people seem to be really interested in iron fluxes. But that seems like it kind of fits under a larger category, which is feedbacks between the sediments and primary productivity. So not just what happens to the carbon once it gets to the sediment, but what role the sediments play in fertilizing and, or vice versa. And I feel like iron flux and iron transport, iron cycling in the water column falls under that. Maybe also like denitrification sediments could fall under that, because part of the reason we care about that is depletion of nitrate. And anyway, I think maybe like a larger category that could fit some of these conceptually is feedbacks between sediments and primary productivity.
Go Talia, Benjamin.
Actually, it was a good thought, and I was thinking, wasn't sure how to bring it up, but working off of like California, Mexico, EBUS, Oregon systems for iron fluxes, there's been actually, that's the reason it's research been studied pretty well on it. And I'd say the disconnect isn't entirely in the flux coming out of the segment, but trying to link that to where the iron goes. So like we did this whole cruise on the like continental shelf, but what seemed to be important was actually looking at the continental slope and the transport of stuff in the water column and its settling and its resuspension off those sorts of processes.
Yeah.
So like trying to link the sediment with other things.
Yeah, so like fluxes, not just at the sediment water interface, but following the whole path to where it can actually improve.
was wondering if the conveners and co-conveners could refresh my memory on what are the two or three, what are the questions that we're trying to answer here with, the 5 major challenges are. What is it that we want? What is it, what are we focusing on? Like how to make better models, how to couple models with observations? Do we just want a benthic flux database? Could you just remind me, like, what our principal goal is with this discussion?
So I think both like data modeling together to like better include this in a Earth system perspective. But there's a lot that's missing because the people that are working on other systems are not looking at this and they're talking to each other more than we are. I mean, I'm just new to this community, and the other one, and it's like, this is missing, we need to add it. And it's been very hard to do this connection and to find, such an interdisciplinary area to like really understand what the data is and what the bottlenecks are, and like, how do we incorporate this?
So I have a suggestion. Maybe we can add comments to the document, instead of editing like I did over there. Because then it will be able to capture the discussion directly, and you'll be able to have a more complete thing later.
Jeremy, do you want to unmute? Yeah, we can do that.
Sure. Yeah, I think the comment I was going to try to make was related to that question that was just asked that Cristina answered, which was, I think one of the motivations for this workshop, like Cristina said, was thinking about how, well, addressing what are the inadequacies in our representation of sediments in Earth system models. And the importance of that is that we use these Earth system models to make predictions of the future. And if we think the sediments, at least in parts of the world, are important, are we representing them well enough? Are the mechanisms, appropriately, included so that, those models are somewhat informative? And so, I saw that as potentially one of the major challenges is how do we build models that we can incorporate into larger scale ocean models that represent the sediments enough. They'll never represent all of the deep mechanistic detailed understanding we have of all of these processes, but what are the key pieces of information that we need to have to constrain those models in a way that will make them useful to sort of be in that context? Because it's not only those models we can think of as, addressing feedbacks that might result from iron fluxes from the sediment. They might be tools that we can use to understand, an intervention, like an MCDR intervention in the ocean. They can help us look at big Earth perturbations, that maybe are different. I don't know. But I think that's just what I wanted to try to express, because I think we had a lot of these conversations within the steering committee group, but I haven't seen it kind of come to the fore in our discussion yet at the meeting.
Now, so just a clinic said, what's a pulse versus the, a sustained? Because if you're also gonna project forward climate and we're not taking this is like not present, right? So all these projections, all these feedbacks, they're not there. So we need, there's probably things we can do right now and things we need to improve to continuously improve. So what are these things? So data synthesis for one, and some of the mechanisms we need to understand. Kinetics,
if you want to make the process temporal scale limits.
So yeah, I think one of the things that's going to be important, and I think this is where modelers and experimentalists, observationalists need to come together, is we talk about definitions. And I'll just keep beating on iron for the sake of beating on iron. But when I talk about a flux of iron from the sediments, I may mean something very different than what someone who models iron as almost a passive tracer thinks of with iron. And I think it's really important that And I think that's important too, from the data mining sort of perspective that was brought up, that observationalists and modelers need to talk together so that if a modeler, for example, thinks, oh, I can use this data on this to do blah, blah, blah. Someone who's actually made those kind of measurements can say, I'm not so sure you want to go down that road, or let's talk about that before you go down that road. So I think that's where, bridging those gaps and better communication can help to really move things forward rather than going down the primrose path and then discovering, oops, I shouldn't have gone there.
Mhm. It's not a pest and tracer head, there's.
I know it's not, I'm just, like I said, I'm just being provocative. for the sake of-
But no, I from a biogeochemical modeler who has needed iron data before, that is something that we need to talk about.
Yeah.
Indeed. It's like, it's really hard, and then you find these 3 data points. And then people are like, yeah, I'm not sure I would trust that. It was really hard. And I'm like, okay, so now I'm down to 0 data points that I can actually use to inform my model.
Well, I think it's important, if you only have 3 data points, then you only have 3 data points and you do what you can, but you just make sure you express all the appropriate caveats.
Yeah.
And that's, then people, they'll criticize you, but you can say, well, yeah, I know that, but it's the best I can do.
That.
Yeah, these questions on like, what are the higher level objectives, the one term that I think kind of encompasses what we're trying to do here is bending pelagic coupling, right? Like just understanding that as like a first mechanism, whether you're talking about iron, oxygen, the organisms that are there, that's really sort of the overall goal. And the other side of this that is kind of a higher level objective like that also is that, we really have an objective of moving closer to the coast with models and long term, right? And as we move closer to the coast with models and begin resolving those coastal interactions, benthic pelagic coupling just becomes more important. So there's kind of these 2 higher level things of the benthic pelagic coupling and also increasing our model resolution as we move towards the coast, and they kind of go hand in hand. So.
Yeah, you're looking at the coastal ocean and you don't have these fluxes right, and you don't have these fluxes right. And then you're doing all your interpretation based on these fluxes, right? So are even these processes, tuned right? So iron, putting the bio and biogeochemistry, eco biogeochemistry, better understanding of all like extreme events and repeated extreme events as climate change has more of an impact. Inorganic or organic carbon dynamics.
But that last one, the coupling of different things, so like thinking about different metabolisms in context and how they affect each other and the carbon system, and then that's setting up your feedbacks for benthic pelagic coupling, right? With loss of fixed nitrogen, loss of supply of iron, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm thinking here is that we have all these processes that we need to understand better. Should we add some, active things that we can do to improve on it? Just coming back to iron, we need to understand better what are some of the things that modelers need to know, what are some of the ways that we can.
For the iron, I was also, I think one of the things we need to, so I think we get a better understanding of like the strength of particulate for like carbon, for example. Well, I wasn't so sure how much of that we have for like the solid state of iron. So if you were to need that, the right form of iron to kind of drive your model, I think that, at least from what I worked on, I think that not a number of studies is being done on that part. given the father iron have different phases, the reactive phase and or how we don't have more data, trying to resolve that part. I think maybe as a community, we also need to kind of improve on that part.
More iron data.
More, yeah, but now more on the solid phase, because I guess like from the model perspective, you need that for the boundary flux of iron. We have, quite a number of data for the carbon, for iron flux, for manganese flux, if you're interested in that one, the model, a very little data point for that one. Yeah.
Nick,
Following up on that, can we say something like use existing data and models to identify, or like prioritize future sampling and identify uncertainties? Right, because I think this is the key, right? Don't just sample the sample.
I think before we do that, we need the data synthesis, because it's been really hard to understand what all the data mean. It's collected, it's all over the place, it's all over the time. And it's been a kind of a challenge to put together and interpret that data in a way that can be useful for model validation.
There's 2 points. One is like the data management side. I think that's definitely needed. We have the data, we just need to look for them, put them somewhere that we can actually use, in a format that we can actually use. Because right now they are scattered all over the place, different format, different servers, and it's very difficult to just use them. And then the second point is regarding human impacts and it's climate change. So climate change is not the only like human impacts that is affecting the ocean, and from with the deep sea mining and trawling. And so I think we have to be careful when we talk about human impacts. What do we actually want to get out of it?
Especially the coastal.
You'd ask like how to move forward, and I see anyone like this. I think that it would be really neat to be, we talked, I think yesterday in our last afternoon group about this idea of coupling like models, you make a measurement and then that model and measurements, it's like a life cycle. And one of the ways we could try to get at that more quickly and moving, we also talk about doing like lab experiments, is doing mesocosm experiments. Some of like the Merle mesocosms and other mesocosms around the world have like transformed our understanding of how things are connected. And it would be this amazing way to talk about getting everyone at the same spot to make all the different measurements that we can make. And you can replicate it and you can perturb it in different ways. And then you can model a lot of it. And then I was gonna swear for some reason. And then it's not but I think so if I think lab experiments are, I mean, everything is wrong with stuff, but the large scale mesocosm experiments can really, really be helpful. And so if we're like making suggestions on like, what are the things we could do? Trying to increase the turnover of the life cycle between modeling and measurements. Mesocosm could provide a really good.
Aslo is think of who are so super exciting, but where they have, like organisms in some, you know what I mean, to sort of bring the bio back into the body. So they had some with and without, you know what I mean, in terms of that vein, which was really interesting to sort of and thinking about, process wise roles.
Yeah, I mean, the Merle mesocosms, they did that. They had animals in some cases. They took sediment from different places. They put nitrogen in. It like informed TMDL modeling for better or worse. I mean, there's like, they've added grazers and stuff. I mean, there's things you could.
But the facilities.
Yeah, the facilities are few and far between. They're expensive, but if you think about like going to sea, not that.
Yeah, can I just, part of what made Merle really impactful, right, was that you had Scott Nixon and folks doing that, but there was really tight coupling with modelers.
Yes.
Like Dom DeToro, developed sediment flux modeling coming out of that. I know Dave and Dom were working early in the Chesapeake Bay program. Like, so I don't know, that's part of the recommendation, right? Is if you're going to do those mesocosms, modelers need to be there, on day one.
Yeah, that's something that came up yesterday as well, that this needs to be done from the onset of every single project.
This is coming from paper, from proposal to paper.
Yeah, proposal of paper. Are you all aware of the database DBCBED?
Yeah, we discussed it in our.
Oh, okay, so,
Yeah.
so DBCBED has green size, compiles green size analysis, I just wanted to mention that. Related to the mesocosm experiments, I wonder if, because, I'm thinking about Nick Ward's project with TNEL and what he's been heading up. They're doing a lot of this stuff on limit, but now he has been moving, or that project has been moving into the coastal system, and I wonder if we could collaborate with them to set up the mesocosm experiments in forests, and they do these extreme events with these inundations, flood events, moving into the coast. Maybe we could partner with them for these mesocosm experiments, which is just related to my general comment about like if one of the goals is to make this measurements or this continuous model from the coast to the open ocean, where do you sample? Like, can we get a specific, is there something that we could do to build off of what Wally just said? Is there a location that we could focus some of our efforts on that would say, have some constraint parameters where we could get this first order?
I think that's something that's come up, is like how much data is enough in each of the places, and that's not something we're set to do right now. So that might be a framework, right? That you do this mesocosms, you get the mechanisms, you understand what type of perturbations, and then from our natural understanding of the world, like what are some places that we could kind of target?
Yeah.
One
more question.
Yeah.
I think when we're talking about all of these coastal systems, we haven't talked a lot about SGD. And so I think we need to think about some rainbound water discharge, which is very different from the way we've been talking about permeable sandy sediment, where you're just thinking about wave and tidal action. There is this huge input to the coastal zone that is not related to tides, well, somewhat related to tides, but not related to wave and wave action. So broadly, where I'm going with this is that wherever we want to target some of these things on, we need to think about just mass balance constraints. Where is sediment moving? And what are your mass fluxes of water?
I have a question. Is this the 5 major challenges or opportunities are strictly scientific or also social side? Are we going to cover the social side as well? For example, access to.
I would argue we should.
Science.
And that has been brought up. We have all this like ideas for great mesocosms and everything. Once you're justifying how you're gonna spend your money, people are like, well, what's it for me here? And it's very hard to justify doing things in places that don't have access to this. So a lot of the what we're thinking about. How do we fill in the spatial gaps, and how do we consider the needs of, other places that are not going to be able to do as much?
So one of the cool things about mesocosms is you could bring in lots of people though, and we talked about like training, right? It's like an awesome training opportunity, and then at least people can go as a first step, can go and then take those methods and measure it.
To follow up on this idea of how do you get these measurements, I think, and I keep suggesting go to the freshwater world a little bit, but there's the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, and this is kind of a community where it's a group of scientists who get together every year or two, and they're like, here's a question I have. How do we move from looking at it in my system to looking at it as a global process? And it's maybe somebody will get a small grant to send out a bunch of sampling equipment to 20 or 30 collaborators around the world, and everybody just collects those samples and sends it back. And I wonder if this type of thing, in addition or kind of next to mesocosms, is a really good approach, starting to fill in these data gaps. And that's been a really successful way of pushing forward kind of the lake biogeochemical understanding in a short period of time.
I'll add to that also, all these basic observations we do, it can be very different based on just the RPM of the instrument we're using to generate these fluxes, because it changes your benthic boundary layer. So I think there needs to be some kind of standardization. Or at least explain what was the benthic boundary layer for your setup, which is missing in many studies.
Or at least report your RP.
Report your, yeah.
Yep.
And the height maybe, so we
Yeah.
can calculate the
Yeah.
boundary layer. Is it 500 micron, 100?
Some better metadata.
Yeah. Because we cannot expect, and this is the lesson we learned from geotraces, because I was involved in the intercalibration. We cannot expect people to change their experimental setup. Everybody has their own setup for whatever reason, but we should be able to compare across that plot. So if we have some sort of way to calibrate that, it will, well, long way towards more.
Approve, publish all the data with publish all the data with standardized metadata that's more comprehensive than what we get.
Well, maybe the
Yeah.
essential variables, ocean variables, kind of task that these disciplinary institutes may be an opportunity to kind of suggest these to the broader global community. I don't know if that's part of that, but it seems like a good pathway to get that.
Connect to those.
Yeah, it's another great use of sort of larger scale user process studies, is being able to do those cross comparisons and put the variables in place that you can then compare those data sets.
I lost count of how many we're at.
Yeah, I think the bullet points here in green and the coupling of process and measurements, right? I think it's the same theme we have for coupling different systems and measurements, and then there's needs for data management and data sharing and comparisons. And I think that's including if we think about coupling both in measurements, data, and then in modeling different systems, that includes lab experiments and mesocosms. And for me, that's the two most major points coming up. Yeah. And if you want to scroll back on top, yeah.
Here.
So when I see from a modeling perspective, to understand the benthic processes, I would say that, the supply of organic matter that is hitting this sea floor is kind of the primary driver of whatever is happening in the benthic colony. So that would be like one of the very major component or like major constraint on how my benthic process is going to respond. So getting that right is one of the very good, main challenges. Because all the organic matter is what is driving the biogeochemical processes in the cell. So how much is coming from the primary production to the sea floor is something important. And also, when you have a muddy sediment, your diffusion is controlling the transport process in the sediment. But if you have a sandy sediment, that time you don't have the diffusion processes which are dominating, but you have the attraction processes which are dominating. How do you parameterize these two kinds of processes in the model? So that is another thing to consider, and kind of an open question. And because sandy sediment, you have the measurements are very rare, as Vani was pointing out. But they are also important and have a large geographical span. So Those are some of the, you know, the open questions which I'm trying to figure out.
Everyone taking notes, but it's good.
Amending stuff.
I mean, okay, like a weird idea I have in mind, but maybe I don't know if some of you might want up to the idea. So we were discussing about so a couple of you have mentioned about data comparison, meta thing that and all that kind of stuff. I was wondering how much of that we could also do, or at least move forward as a community for the model side. So, you know, like the climate community, they have the FINIC models. They have like coupled model, intercomparison projects, something like that. Obviously, we can't get to that level because every model is kind of different and all that. But I was just thinking how, you know, moving forward, you know, instead of modeling, telling about the chemistry, we could have something, you know, to that particular stuff. So I don't know if, you know, some of the models that in here, I'm really interested in the idea to see how we could develop not only just standard, but also protocols of some of the essential materials that we need, but also see how, you know, different models respond to that. And maybe perhaps we might develop some interesting scientific output on that one.
That's a very good point. That would help.
I'm thinking about it like
What can we do back?
I'm thinking of the ones that meet the sediments model in that comparison something. So yeah, if there's any models around who are interested in that kind of thing, maybe we could discuss them.
Yeah, I like that idea. Anyone else on this side of the room?
I'll give a couple of points. Since we're talking about modeling now, and mesocosm were mentioned, and that's this great opportunity to study mechanistic processes and for education. And the same goes for modeling, because mesocosms are model environments and models are environments. Yeah, I think I concur with the idea that we can not only compare models between themselves, we can use models for communication with non-modelers, because I think that basically if models don't work well, then we did not incorporate some understanding, we're lacking something. And so I think that there is an opportunity to make everyone a little bit modelers, to give you some understanding of what models can do, and models are very different. That's why we need to compare them. And I think that can be used as this basically conceptual framework to advance our understanding. And another thought is about the challenges and priorities, because we can look at that mechanistic understanding is insufficient on many processes and aspects of benthic system. But if we just give them like non-systematically, because there is a lot of things that people are working on and they are great, they are improve our understanding, but we maybe should start from something that is there at the bottom of that list, which is why we want to improve that understanding. What benefits will it bring? And I think that funders are also interested in that. What is the impact of that improved understanding? So marine environment, oceans are impacted in many different ways. And I think that most of these impacts are related to the sediments and related systems. So MCDR, blue carbon, trawling, and we're talking about climate change as well, because we don't know when models, or global models don't include this whole benthic cycle. And so if we identify those areas, and for all of those areas, there is some lack of mechanistic understanding. So which aspects of this which all these mechanistic aspects are most important to improve our understanding of human impacts on the ocean.
Kind of building off of what Sam was saying earlier about just implementing like pouring on some of these cruises. I think discussions across disciplines is just like an underrated opportunity to potentially collect more data too, because like funding a field campaign is really expensive, but like adding on things to existing field campaigns is often considerably less expensive if somebody has like a parameter they want to measure or instrumentation available. That was something I learned by necessity during my PhD, just being like, okay, like what else can we measure here? And who has the tools available to measure it? And I think that can lead to really interesting collaboratory and multidisciplinary science, which seems like that's kind of a direction we need to go, right?
My understanding is people know better than me that preventing research, because it takes a while and people are not very happy about extending their station time.
But not only like cruises, like I'm thinking like site specific stuff too. And I'm not familiar with like the sediment deployments and things, or like the kind of data. But for instance, like we go out to the same coral reef sites pretty regularly and put out instrumentation or clean instrumentation or do surveys. And there's certainly time to collect other things. And so for instance, like we're putting out sensors that are measuring like surface chemistry or like mid-water column chemistry, like it wouldn't be very hard to add things at the benthic layer or do more sediment focus, but like the lab that I'm in just doesn't do that. And I think it's just a matter of like having those talks.
Yeah.
On sort of this large scale topic of like what's the handshake between models and observations and how can models kind of help out? There's a modeling tool which I know nothing about called an OSSI, and observing systems simulation experiments. And one of the goals of those models is to provide guidance on optimal design of an observing system. And I wonder if there are some modeling tools out there that can help us better define the where and the what of what an observation needs to be, right? Like how can existing modeling frameworks help us kind of define where we need to do something? OSSE. Awesome. I don't know if anybody works with those, knows what those are. It's just come up and it took me a day to find them.
They're basically like subsampling your model to see if it would be representative of like the total. If the model's perfectly interpolated in time and space. So then it can just get bits like simulation. If you had like sediment trap here, would it capture the expert plot? Or versus putting, how many do we need to capture the distribution? So yeah, subsampling model is definitely something we can do.
I just Googled OSSI and found out there's an ocean modeling and OSSI center at University of Miami in the Cooperative Institute where I work.
I mean, that's how I've seen there might be more.
He was like, isn't that where you work? I was like, yeah.